Thank you to all the speakers. We will soon invite you all back to the stage. But before that, I would like to introduce to the moderator of the third panel, Daniel Urey. He has a background in political science, and he is a head of LABLAB research and design think tank based in Stockholm. Today, LABLAB operates along the frontiers of ecological and spatial transformations in the Nordic and Baltic Sea region. Before LABLAB, Daniel Urey was engaged in the strategic development of international urbanization programs conducted by Fabriken and Contemporary Arts Center in Stockholm. Daniel has the experience of working in the Baltic Sea region, the Balkans, Middle East, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. And he is a board member at the Milksgarden Museum too. Welcome, Daniel.
Hello, hello, hello. So I would like to welcome our panel, our guest speakers. Please join me. Agnese, please. Thank you. And we have a microphone over there. That's right. Only one microphone to go around. Can we bring one more, please? That would be very nice. Thank you. So thank you again for your presentations, very bold presentations, and thank you for all of you to be here. I've been thinking regarding our presentations. The theme for our conversations today was, the topic of this presentation was to talk about and moving beyond the intersections of urban and rural. And somehow, we continue to shape our conversation today from an urban discourse. So, should I say the countryside is dead, long live the countryside, or shall we rather talk about the urbanized countryside? Agnese?
Thank you for picking out the only non-architect for answering this question. I don't think the countryside is dead. I just don't think we have to think about it in the same terms as we're used to. And I think, especially in the Latvian case, we keep dwelling on this beautiful kind of era of agricultural grandeur in the 1930s, which has, for a long time not been there. Even in Soviet times with the collectivized farming and so on, it was still also kind of a mock-up of countryside. It wasn't essentially that. It was too orchestrated and too neat to actually represent whatever is in the minds of people when they say the rural areas and the beauty of the rural areas. And I think we have to move away from this this conception, and even if the countryside is emptying, as it is in the case of Latvia, then we repurpose it. We make it more convenient for people to live there. We don't have to expect the business to always be in the countryside. What about it just being a place of homemaking? That is the direction I see for the development, and that of course involves developing infrastructure, connectivity, and so on, whatever you guys have been talking about as well.
I think that we just should rethink how we perceive the countryside. It's not anymore so populated, but there is still a place for some people. There are big farms, which are totally, not totally, but rather automatized, the production there. There are living in countryside some people who just like to live and who can work so that they work for the stock exchange in New York or in London, but they live in some lonely island in Estonia. It's also a possible way of life, but what we can't expect anymore is that there is everywhere public services. There is, in Estonia just currently there are a lot of discussions that it's impossible to provide the postal services of each farmstead, and these things. There are not any more schools because you need a certain amount of children to keep up the school. But if the population is so scattered and so sparse, you can't have these traditional services. That's why we must rethink the whole situation.
I think, first of all, we need to define what we understand, or it's probably impossible to do so, but try and at least narrow down what we understand to be countryside. Like, are we talking about people and services to people and like density of living there? Or are we talking about machines? Are we talking about industry? Are we talking about data centers that mostly live in the countryside? Like, what is it that we're talking about? If we're talking about people, then I agree with the first two speakers. But I definitely don't agree with the notion that the countryside is becoming like less dense if we take other things. It's becoming more and more computated, or like, you know, computationally organized. It's becoming more and more effective, in certain cases more effective than some industry, you know, fields. So in a sense, like, the countryside is just the extension of our current civilization, or like our, you know, how to say, like the human, whatever, condition, you know, that we're currently in. I don't see it, because we do need to make a distinction as well between countryside. What are we talking about? Are we talking about arable land? Are we talking about the wilderness? Are we talking about, you know, like, for example, if we know that the cities are about 2% of the, you know, global land, let's say, what do you call it, area, then the arable land is about 11, and the wilderness is about 16. So what is it that we're talking about is what needs to be defined first, I think.
You know, what I tried to show is on the example of Switzerland, which is very much a kind of an urban landscape where the difference between city and the countryside is actually not that large. It's a very integrated system because, again, we are at the cross-section of a topographical space, the Alpine Rim, and a topological space, the European urban system. Right, Switzerland is right at the intersection of these two systems. And that generated a kind of an urban landscape, i.e. a kind of polycentric urban region, which is highly integrated and highly, it's kind of a green industrial city, so to speak. So I would not say that from a systemic point of view, the city and the countryside is something dialectically opposite, right? It's rather an issue of gradient, you know, and where a countryside is just a less densely settled part of the global urban system which we have today. However, from a cultural point of view, from a framing point of view, and that then turns into politics, of course the countryside is something, right? The countryside is very much the part which voted pro-Trump against Clinton, you know, which is in Switzerland a kind of a much more conservative part of the nation as in the city. So the difficulty is a bit we have to differentiate between a systemic, urbanistic point of view where, again, we have to think in gradients and in systems which are all inherently open and inherently connected. And on the other hand, we have to think in cultural framing terms where, of course, these immediately become polarized, dialectical, and antagonistic at moments. And the trick, of course, is by intelligent political narratives to make sure that this doesn't escalate, right, but rather in a kind of a virtuous circle becomes a more and more compatible.
Agnese will fill in here, but I also have just to add here and a question to you. So, because when you start talking about culture, I was thinking very much, do we project too much nostalgia on these rural areas, on the countryside? And if we do that, what kind of consequences does it have? And how do we maneuver through these changing landscapes?
Yeah, I guess the answer to this question is also linked to what you, Markus, just said. I think one of the first steps is to stop thinking and talking of the countryside as the conservative area, because we are also perpetuating it, right, with the discourse. And what we see also, I mean, the kind of Riga agglomeration where people move out, it's their seeking of the countryside. For us, it's grandma and apples and summers in the hay fields and whatnot. It is, of course, much of nostalgia. And city people are also looking for it. The liberal city people also want to be in the countryside. But if we keep kind of this distinction also politically and perpetuate this differentiation, we will never see true interaction between, you know, more people who are more city dwellers and people who are more kind of rural inhabitants. This is also what I meant when I said we have to rethink about what the countryside is. Is it just a place to preserve some kind of nostalgic memories, or to preserve or even develop farming, but still farming as the industry that, you know, should live there? That is the kind of shift that we also need in our discourse.
In Estonian case, it's a little bit similar, like you described, that recently at us also appeared quite successful far-right party, EKVE, whose electorate is not mainly but very strongly on countryside, and they consciously play on the votes of these people who feel that they are neglected and they are losers, and a lot of people in countryside feel nowadays so. But in general in Estonia, the regard towards the countryside is not only nostalgic and conservative because of this history of collective farms. Collective farms clearly felt that they are progressive, they do well, they are on the side of winners inside the Soviet society, they are industrial, they are modern. So this national romantic conservative regard towards the country is only one possible way. There exist more different perspectives.
I would like to ask to Markus the question about digitalization. What role, what is the impact of digitalization on rural areas? Is it for the good? Is it for the bad? How will it change mobility also for people?
Okay, that's actually a deep question. I mean, you know, first of all, openness always generates imbalance. That means the more connected the system is, by definition, that generates imbalance. It doesn't generate equality, interestingly enough, it generates imbalance, because migration is easily possible. Mobility is there, you know. So if you have a lack of opportunity in the countryside, you move to the city. If you have a lack of opportunity in Riga, you move to Paris or you move to London, you know. So the more open the system is, the more imbalance is automatically generated. The same is true for markets, the same is true for finance, you know, Piketty's argument and so on and so on. Now, that means you need to have active responses to redistribute, you know. So, and in Switzerland, this was very much the idea in the entire nation state's history since 1848, to decentralize functions, to spend money on the countryside in terms of infrastructure, in terms of education, security. This is a long kind of a political history to do that. So with the digital tool, again, it's the same ambivalence, right? You cannot say it's good or bad, it is for or against the countryside, because technology is always ambivalent, right? But what we are interested in with this CVD idea is to basically empower, by digital technologies, local communities in a way where the technology is so efficient that it becomes affordable also for small entities. So we are trying to generate a sense of subsidiarity, and that's the key word in the thinking, subsidiarity, right? Also in a digital future. So rather than having the connectedness which digitalization generate to generate even more imbalance, i.e. in the end the data refineries are only in the Silicon Valley, so data is extracted and only worked on in the Silicon Valley or other places, which basically turns Europe into the black continent, so into the Africa, you know, resource rich but refinement poor, of the contemporary world, right? So instead of doing that, we're trying to relocalize governance of data by data commons. So The point is, any technology requires a kind of an institutional response to make sure that this redistribution and the strengthening of the local becomes possible. But if you do this actively, then I think the digital can be hugely interesting for rural situations. And we all know that, right? We work at home slightly outside the city, and we only commute to the city when necessary. But important is the statement that the digital is not a panacea, you know. It needs to be organized well, it needs to be thought about well, it needs to, in the end, lead to new institutions which allow us to also use the digital well. We need a kind of a Marxist revolution of the digital age in some ways, right? So Marxism was basically saying, you know, you have a production system, generates culture. False consciousness is the moment where these two are not aligned, right? That generates an emancipation of the local production force, right, the worker. And that then, through a series of steps, led to the social welfare state, right, which is a fairly good, stable solution. Then the new technological phase came, and now we need a new adaptation of our institutions to this new age.
Continue to talk about the digitalization and the impact on the cities, on the rural areas. And also the question I was having here is because from the Swedish perspective, when we talk about digitalization, and social planning, we talk very much about the green digital cities, green technology, and all this kind of power of innovation perceptions are being put in the cities, in the big cities. So you see that there is this kind of this gap between the cities of Sweden and the rural areas of Sweden. So this is also was the question: can we only think that innovation, culture, and all this can take place in these urban centrums? And what can be done? What can be done in order to shift this kind of modernistic approach that only the centers can generate this?
In the case of Estonia, this digitalization has actually supported the empty of country, because we have tried to build up quite efficient state, which is quite digitalized, but it means that this state doesn't need any more employees in county towns. And because state has removed all its services from county towns around Estonia, all the state services are only in 4 centers in Estonia. They have really helped the countryside to empty. If we take Baltics, if we compare Baltics to Switzerland, unfortunately, we don't have a welfare society, and as we started 25 years ago from the scratch, there is just no real money available for subsidizing life in countryside, what is possible in Switzerland or in Sweden.
Density, again, you say before you were talking about density.
Exactly, the lack of the density, and this digitalization has caused it.
But I guess, density, but in the Swiss, in your case, you were showing the connection between density and infrastructure and always regenerating that. Could you please?
Yeah, I think we need to understand that, again, in any open system, you always have a pendulum which swings. You have dynamics which play themselves out. The dynamic currently is one where both in terms of demography as well as narrative, the cities are on a rise, right? The Metropolitan Revolution by Bruce Cutts describes that. He also writes about new localism and things like that. Of course, we had Florida with technology tolerance and talent as being the thing which drives people to cities, etc., etc. So this is the narrative of our day. This narrative will change, right? This narrative will the time frame will be interesting to see, but this narrative will change again, because this pendulum is kind of swinging back and forth. Interesting to note is that the liberal revolution in the mid-19th century, Switzerland was founded in 1848, was very much a kind of an urban phenomenon, and the urban powers at the moment, they tried to then kind of conquer the hinterland. You know, for example, London built country roads up to Scotland to make sure that both the market and the army can move kind of flexibly, right? Now we have the ironic situation that the infrastructure state, which was stable until around 2000, is kind of now reorganizing itself again, right? This kind of the idea of a territorial, cohesive, fully kind of a formed modern nation state, that is now changing again due to, amongst other things, globalization and digitalization. And in this reorganization, we can also think that the postal service is maybe not anymore something which is infrastructure state can do anymore, because the infrastructure state, however much we believe in it right now, so the modern nation state, is actually an old model, a model which has to be reinvented. So maybe the postal service, and we see that of course already now with glass fiber and email, needs to be reinvented into something digital, agile, and maybe not state organized. You know, so again, the idea of CVD, our spin-off, is that it's a bottom-up, civil society-driven, digital-enabled way of maybe reorganizing certain functions which the modern infrastructure state cannot do anymore. This is true for Switzerland even, and for structurally more weak regions, it's an even a stronger impetus to try to do that.
There's an interesting development regarding the postal service in Latvia, where it's more and more seen as a social service, as someone who postmen check on people living in very remote areas. They don't just deliver letters. They now have new functions, because of course the letters and retirement pensions and things can be transferred digitally, right? But now they have this other function. But what I also wanted to notice, I think when we were talking about the Baltic region and the 3 Baltic states, we also have to think about what, you know, urban areas mean. Riga, of course, a city of 700,000 people, that's still not a lot even in European terms. But the other kind of more urban areas, a city called Lāce that is now developing a lot of service-based, it's developing as a hub for service-based industry, so IT and so on. It's a city of not even 20,000 people, I think maybe even a little over 20,000 people. It's a town in rest of Europe terms. Are we still talking about urban areas in this context? Is it really something urban? Or what do we call this? I don't think urban areas are the only places where the, you know, innovations develop. But this is also a kind of an in-between place. Not really urban and not really rural.
Thank you for saying this, because I mean, when I started to think about this conversation, I was very much looking for, do we need a new language, new tools to explain these transitions that we've been talking about? And Markus, with your presentation, you took another tool, the deep history, deep urbanization. I mean, the deep history goes back into the humans and then connect that to the urbanization process. I would like to get back to the question of culture again, and Ivan. I was thinking it was very beautiful when you were telling the story, the action that took place of the 2 choirs singing from each border. And when we're talking about rural areas, landscapes, that is so still connected to identity, at least in this Nordic Baltic context. And Narva has this this twin city, these 2 languages. When it comes to the language, are there different ways of relating to the landscape with these 2 languages that lives next to each other?
By languages, you mean Estonian and Russian?
Yes, sorry.
Well, see, the funny part with Narva is that really the language is one. It's Russian. Like, it's Russian on both sides. That's how we're, let's say, different as a city within Estonia. But I'm not sure. Maybe there are different situations, like in Valga, for example, context, or in Helsinki, Tallinn. Like, maybe Mart has a better idea.
No, I just wanted to add that in reality, Ivan is perfectly fluent in Estonian. But
Thank you.
But may I now address to you that you said that Lithuanians were more tolerant than Estonians and Latvians. Why do you think so? Is it partly because there was less Russian colonists in Lithuania than in Latvia and Lithuania, and the problem for us is that we have not digested these waves of immigration.
Probably it's one of the reasons, but Lithuanians also had a Russian community and a Polish community, and actually their links with the Polish community are about as long as for Latvia and Estonia with the Russian Empire. So yes and no. Probably the fact that our integration policies have not worked as well, or there haven't really been integration policies for much of 90s and 2000s. It's kind of incorporation policies more. Then that, of course, fail because they don't engage in a dialogue. And we now see some sort of segregation. We also see two media spaces. We see the influence of Russian-speaking media not created here, and the effect of this information that it has on the Russian-speaking community, and how that deepens this segregation sometimes. Of course, that has to do with it, but even though it was a couple of percentage points, all Baltic states in general are quite negative towards this, and it I think has to do with the fact that even there are different ethnicities, we are still quite homogenous in terms of our appearance and the languages that we communicate in.
You know, what is interesting for me as an outside observer, and I might make a lot of mistakes when I'm saying this, but what is interesting is that the Baltics actually is a fairly heterogeneous environment, right? You have, and here I want to make an important point regarding history and system boundary, so to speak. Historically, you know, Lithuania was oriented towards Poland. You know, it had this kind of kingdom going all the way to the Black Sea, which makes a completely different mindset, looking more towards Europe, right? The Estonians today, they are talking very much to Helsinki, to Scandinavia. Ideally, they want to be part of Scandinavia, even building a tunnel to do that, and so on. And Latvia is kind of caught in between.
We can't decide, yeah.
Yeah, so Latvia can't decide, you know, which means you're very much a kind of a port city ruled by other interests, you know, Russian interests, the German interests, and so on, right? And then the interesting idea right now could be maybe, you know, Switzerland is also an extremely heterogeneous construct, right? There is a French, Italian, German. However, in the 1848, it became clear that it made sense to make a system boundary around a liberal operating system, our modern constitution, right? And this modern constitution generated a huge draw of intelligent people, Huguenots, watchmakers, industrialists, and so on, to enter this space of a clean, federally organized, fair, transparent, non-corrupt, and non-conservative environment. So to actually go about their business. You know, so while in the early 19th century, Metternich and all these people tried to reorganize Europe towards an old way of working, Switzerland was the liberal avant-garde, right? So what was heterogeneous before, due to this system boundary, became homogeneous. You know, the system boundary is very visible in Narva, right? And you profit from that system boundary. You can play that system boundary. And if there were an alliance of the Baltic states thinkable, where more cooperation would be thinkable, a more common identity would develop, then in this sort of sense of subsidiarity, all of a sudden you would have a lot more opportunity to play, you know, to collaborate, etc., etc. In Switzerland, we call this idea cooperative sovereignty. You know, you're sovereign, but you also cooperate. You know, and in this form of cooperative sovereignty, this could be, I think, really interesting. And you know, learn the best from Estonia with these digital initiatives, which I think are brilliant. I mean, worldwide brilliant, right? Learn from the best from Lithuanians with the idea of getting to EU money. You know, they're quite clever in doing that. And getting learning the best from the Latvians, being a bit stubborn and kind of you know, interested in the collective with this kind of big singing contests and so on. You know, so out of that you could forge a Baltic identity, which I think could be incredibly future-proof.
I'm just gonna add to the kind of comparison that you did Estonia a little bit to the Finland, you know, Lithuania a little bit to that, and then you say in between we cannot choose. And I was thinking very much of the song of Joy Division, "Love Would Tear Us Apart," that you'll be somewhere over there. Okay, please, you wanted to?
Yes, I wanted to respond to Markus that this heterogeneity is different in Switzerland and in Baltics because the cooperation between ethnicities are all the ethnicities who are indigenous people inside this territory. But in Baltics, the indigenous people are Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, and all the others have, during the history, appeared to be there. So all the rest are the newcomers, and that's why the historical dimension is totally different. Although these Germans can be newcomers for 7 centuries ago, but still they didn't integrate because they were in a privileged position, because all those who have come to these lands have been invaders.
Yeah, just one answer.
Yes,
there are no indigenous people. Everybody's an immigrant. You just have to go far back enough.
Yeah, and also, how long are you a newcomer? If I have German roots in my family, am I still a newcomer here in Latvia with a very Latvian last name? But I actually think that the point I was also trying to make in my speech about the city level and the separation from nationality and citizenship in very national kind of constitutional terms, that in the framework of your passport, as one way of organizing the society, moving towards an inclusive citizenship where everyone, not regarding their official status, legal status, whatever you want to name it, where everyone becomes a part in making the city. And this is, I think, where we can tear these boundaries down.
I just wanted to comment real fast on the whole, going back to your original question with the levels of tolerance, or how do you want to say that? Estonia and the Baltic states just regained independence 28 years ago. It's like a blip on the radar of time. It's a very short period of time. Why I think we still are, let's say, behind Europe in our tolerance levels are because we just haven't enjoyed the sovereignty enough just yet. We don't feel, how do I say, confident enough about our position on the globe as countries, as entities, to start accepting new things. Like it's almost like human psychology. You need to regain balance sometimes. Like if you come from a situation of stress, which is occupation, you need to, for a moment, you need to go see a psychiatrist, and then you need to kind of find yourself again. And then after a little while, it takes different times for different people. Some people never get out of that state. But after a while, you regain yourself and you're like, okay, I know who I am. Now I am ready to go out and meet people. Why is the first reaction in psychological disorders to, in most cases, to not talk to other people? Because you want to be in yourself. You kind of want to figure out, and in a sense, I think what we're noticing here is a little bit of the same thing, but projected onto an entire nation. So it's essentially a very basic human need to regain balance, and then after that, once you're confident, then you can go and meet other people, accept foreigners who have been invading you all over the last few centuries, this way and that way. Only then will you become a more tolerant society, unless the society is formed by an amalgam. So the case of, for example, I think Switzerland, Luxembourg is another great example where you have a bunch of different nations kind of merged together. I mean, the United States, which is getting a little weird, but basically that's what it was, right? That's how it originated. But if you're talking about a nation state, which in case of the Baltic states is very much the thing, like not a state of an idea, not a democratic state, but a nation state. That idea, it'll take a little while for us to be very tolerant and everything, and that's me, originally Russian-speaking person.
I think it also affects the way we think about the urban and rural dynamic in the Baltics, because certain regions are, more Latvian speaking, more Russian speaking. Some have been more diverse, 50-50 for the whole time. And I think perhaps this is why Riga is also attractive for people coming from various regions, because it accommodates both of these communities. And we will... it still affects the way we think about each region in this country, and how probably all policymakers still think about Narva. That is the first thing that comes to mind. So these identity and cultural issues shape policy making regarding also city planning and infrastructure planning.
Actually, yeah, just a quick comment. I didn't cover this in my speech, but for example, in case of Narva, the entire of Estonia has had multiple real estate booms and busts by now. Narva has zero. Like, we have no privately built residential apartment buildings, like zero of those. Over the span of the last 28 years, one of the reasons is because banks, tend to not lend money. Why do they tend to not lend money? Because you're too close to the Russian border. Like, we don't really trust what's going to happen here. So there is, and that stems from what? From the Russian-speaking population being on the border with Russia and all these headlines that I showed you. So yes, it does influence the built environment directly. Another good thing is that, for example, in Narva, there are more buildings that are not renovated compared to, for example, Tallinn or Tartu. Why is that? Because most of the people in Narva speak Russian, right? Again, most of the programs for renovating buildings are built in Estonian language. Like, the laws are written in Estonian. So people just don't have access. They as if they do, but really they don't, So in a sense, like, this actually... The issue of language and culture, they do influence the built environment in much more direct ways than we sometimes understand.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree with Ivan that there is a problem that the period of independence has been so short that people don't have yet the self-confidence. And I remember then when I was a student and we were very nationalistically minded before the independence was regained. But I really don't understand that after the independence, and you have in your language the whole state research, culture, everything happens, why to be any more nationalist? But if we look at the votes in the for the parliament or for the municipality, we see that so many people still support nationalists, and in my mind, it is really strange.
At the same time, I think the narrative is that Estonia has been trying deliberately to be very international. So the way with the whole digital thing that we're doing, it aims to be part of the bigger international context. And some people just are not ready for that yet. That's one of the reasons that we've, like the main thing, one of the main arguments is of how or why the right parties win or won is because they left people behind. So they got so caught up with the digital revolution, with everything so cool and awesome, that they kind of forgot half of the population behind who have completely different values, or maybe not completely different values, but like they live a different life. Startups are not what they think of life, And so you have this polarization.
And still, I mean, when talking about, you were talking this conversation, and I want to relate back to the maps that Markus was showing before, these neural maps where cities were connecting each other much more than countries. And should we be afraid that, if we are still trying to sit there, to breathe, just to get comfortable in the chair, and then this neural map is, changing so quickly that you don't have the time to jump in? And that's actually a question to Markus, as an outsider, when you listen to these conversations.
I'm next to being a crypto-Marxist, of course, I very much read Jane Jacobs, Economy of Cities, which was an argument against Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. The economic motor always is urban systems, always. I mean, there is no nation state as an economic entity, right? The nation state just provides the operating system. It organizes the protocols and the institutions, but it's not the economic motor itself. So I think that's an important thing. So you always need to think about cities and city networks. The problem is in the Baltic states and actually in the entire eastern region from there, with the exception of this band, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and so on, where like I don't know, I think 90% of all Russians live in this band, which is urbanized, and all the rest of Russia is kind of almost empty. So there is an inherent structural weakness in the urban system in that region, and this is fate. I mean, you cannot do anything against it, right? It's similar like when we did projects in Ljubljana. Ljubljana, Slovenia. Ljubljana is also a fairly isolated city, so that means you need to have a strategy for that particular type of DNA. I think Narva is a brilliant example. You have an isolated city next to a system boundary, so you work with that. Riga is an isolated city, but it has a port, a functioning port. It has an amazing airline, so you work with that. And I think that needs to be the trick. You need to, you cannot compete with, I mean, Riga will never be Zurich, because Zurich is in a particular geographic location. And as Kaplan said, revenge of geography, that simply matters. That's like fate, right? But given that, within the framework you have, you just need to develop the best possible strategies.
And we are soon to letting the people to make some questions. Okay.
Just
short,
a really quick remark.
Really
sorry.
short, because actually Agnese was before you.
I'll be quiet for the rest of the questions.
Sure.
But what I wanted to say and kind of maybe confirm but also argue with Markus, with you, is that in case of Narva, for example, we have a situation where we've been too focused. We've almost been fetishizing our geographical location, that we're next to Russia. We need to find something that we can do with this, And that actually closes, that narrows your vision, and that's the only thing you see. And what I've been practicing with our local decision makers, I was like, imagine you're Rakvere. Rakvere is the town that is right in the middle between Narva and Tallinn. Like, you're kind of in the middle of nowhere. There are fields all around you. There is no Russia. Like, you're just in the space. What would that actually is very liberating exercise to do sometimes. Because we're, on the one hand, yes, we can't negate our geography and the history, right? We're bound to that. That's the reality. But in a sense, that can also be very, that can inflict specifically borders on us that we don't really need.
Thank you, Ivan. Okay, dear people, I know that you're starving, but before you get some food, we will release some questions here. Let's see, I see a hand over there. Could you please give her a microphone? And then I see another hand over there by Friedrich, the second one. And I see 3 questions. Questions, please. Don't huge comments.
Very short. If we speak about Zurich versus Baltic states, Baltic cities, then the blue banana area is very dense, and physical proximity still matters. We don't really have critical mass of people to allow the concentration of services. So do you think that the only way we can attract these services and people is tolerance, or fiscal policy also matters? For instance, if we create a fiscal paradise here and create legal opportunity for opening your business in 2 hours, do you think that might change the situation and attract new businesses and people?
I guess that's a question to Agnese. To whom did you... to whom did you address the question?
Maybe, I would say to Agnese more.
All of those things, of course, matter. Some of the examples I didn't mention, so of course the foreign investors who are already here and who talk about how it is to have a business here coming from the outside, they mention the fiscal regulations. Latvia is actually, it is quite easy to open a business in Latvia. It is in one of the top places in Europe. So it's quick and easy. It's not that difficult. Also, regarding the tax system, we've had some reforms lately. No one's happy with them. But in general, it's not that difficult. We are now, there are some ideas now to maybe develop something for like digital nomads and things to adapt the tax system for people who are on the move, to allow for voluntary tax payments and social tax payments to access some of the services. Of course, those are options, but the number 1 and 2 reasons that foreign investors in Latvia struggle with are both linked to availability of labor. And number 1 is quality of education and specialization and the expertise actually available here. And number 2 is the opportunity to bring workers from abroad. So, sure, opening a business and having a beneficial tax system, it will attract foreign investment in companies, but we actually need someone to work here. So there, I think the tolerance aspect, of course, it's not the only one, but it will be a very crucial one for creating an open environment for workers, sure.
Ivan, I see your eyes. You want to say something or not?
Yes.
Briefly.
Yes.
Is it a response to that question or not?
Yes.
Okay, good.
So e-government. Estonia, I think, has made a crazy jump and declared the whole, what do you call it, like e-residency. Like a genius system. You essentially outsource, you basically put governance into a cloud, and anybody from anywhere in the world can pay you taxes. That's great. So just...
And next year it will also be the digital nomad visa, and will be one of
now we have a second question over there. Yes, please.
All right. Speaking as a transnational, question again to Agnese. What kind of people are leaving the countryside? What kind of people are leaving Latvia, leaving Estonia? Did you go into the micro scale of the social makeup? I'm asking this because your answer at the beginning was quite straightforward. You were saying like, maybe the countryside or the smaller towns or whatever don't even have to generate any kind of economic power or economic wealth.
Yeah. Well, who's leaving? First, who's moving to Riga? And actually, it's almost the same demographic portrait as people who are leaving Latvia. It is younger people in the first 20 years of their economic activity, so from 18 to 35 or so, who are skilled and who have either professional or higher education. And also, this has left an effect, and you also show this in your demographic pyramid regarding Narva, but Latvia has lost 80,000 young people in the past 20 years. The share of young people in the local population has been decreasing tremendously. So there will be two kind of processes in the society that will further empty out the countryside if we don't change the perception about what is the countryside and the rural areas. First is mortality, and second is emigration, and it's already happening.
Okay, the third and last question.
No, just a very, very quick aside. You know, when you look at a map of Poland before and after '89, before it was an ecosystem of an economy, an industrialized economy, which was quite equally distributed. After '89, you immediately have a concentration to Warsaw, maybe Krakow, Poznan, Gdansk, but the rest is emptying out. You know, the reason why this doesn't show up in national statistics is because Warsaw is in Poland, right? But Riga, of course, now has the draw from larger urban centers outside of Latvia. That's why the national statistics shows a loss of people, right? So I think that's, you know, the issue of critical mass is something which immediately happens when you liberate the market.
Thank you. Third and last question, please. Thank you.
My name is Nikos Findikakis. I'm Vice President of the International Union of Architects. And I want to comment to the first speaker, first part, and to flourish the knowledge, not of the speaker, which is big, but of the audience, that after Mesopotamia, then urbanism went to the Cycladic area. And the first city in the world with a parliament was Poliochni in Limnos. And then after that was Bronze Age Akrotiri in Santorini. And then after, the kingdom of Knossos. For your knowledge, I would like also to inform you, the speakers, that the International Union of Architects has an international work program called Intermediate Cities. It's directed by a Spanish professor, Leoptorné, and I invite you to visit the UIA website and to see about the intermediate cities, which is, as I understood, the case of this area. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so we will end up with the intermediate cities and intermediate rural or landscapes. Thank you so much to all of you for this great knowledge production we've been having here. But please, people, feel free to go and eat. I can see certain eyes are a little bit tired, and I'm going to shut up now so we can talk and eat. Thank you. Thank you.